Thanks, Katie, for your very wonderful words. And I have to say that I really thank you all for having me. It's been a pleasure and a real privilege to be here. And now I'll see how much wetland I can squeeze into 15 minutes. While being here, I've worked on a research project that explores the environmental history of European wetlands since 1950. And one aspect of my work deals with a changing visual history of wetlands. And I would like to share some of the findings here with you. Okay. On a warm afternoon in November 1962, a flock of flamingos was flying low. Oh, no flamingos. Here come the flamingos. So they were flying across the wide floodplains of the Camargue, a unique landscape in southern France in the Delta Rhone. The birds, moving from their feeding grounds in the lagoons along the Mediterranean shore, caused some excitement among a crowd which had just arrived at the biological station of Tour du Valat. To the watchers, the passing flock seemed like a message of support, at least according to the proceedings of the meeting. Some 80 people from 12 European countries, reaching from Norway to Yugoslavia, had gathered to change the prevailing narrative of a habitat type that they did not even have a term for. Bogs, fens, mares, quagmires, estuaries, swamps, delta, tidal flat, any water-bound space, really. They had traveled long distances to be part of Project MAR. MAR serving as an acronym, a blend of the Spanish marisma, the French marais, and the English marshland. The host of this project was the head of the biological station, the soft-spoken and yet charismatic Swiss biologist Luc Hoffmann. With him there were some of the most influential environmental networkers of the time, like the British naturalist Peter Scott, you see him on the left, and the ardent ornithologist Phyllis Barclay Smith here with Luc Hoffmann. Supported by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and 3 NGOs, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the International Waterfowl Research Bureau, and the International Office for Bird Protection, they had taken the initiative to change the bad image of swamps. And they did. 8 years later, in February 1971, the Convention for the Protection of Wetlands of International Importance was signed in the small Iranian town of Ramza. The first international and intergovernmental treaty seeking to conserve natural resources and habitats on a global scale. Today there are 170 contracting parties and 2,314 Ramsar sites, and the Starnberger See is one of them. I got interested in this bunch of flamingo admirers and their project as it offers the opportunity to study the transformation of environmental narratives before the ecological awakening of the 1970s. Moreover, there is a curious European moment in this project, one that might tell us more about the pre-development of today's European environmentalism and environmental regime. In the run of the 1950s, messages had been coming in from all over Europe that birds had become under growing pressure. That were not necessarily stunning news, ever since birders had started to get organized at the end of the 19th century in favor of protecting their feathered friends. There was a growing notion of alarm. Loss of breeding and feeding grounds, oil pollution, exploitation of waterfowl had caused a rising concern among ornithologists. Both world wars had left deep imprints on the European land and waterscapes and their flora and fauna. After the war, the situation seemed to get even worse. With the help of steam plows and heavy machinery, bogs and swamps turned into green meadows with grazing cows or fields of wheat and corn, replacing habitats that had hosted a myriad of unique species. Incoming news told about the fundamental changes in bogs and deltas in the Netherlands, Germany, the USSR, Greece, and Romania, all over Europe. In the Camargue, Luc Hoffmann had watched how industrial and agro-industrial interests had turned to the region. Mass tourism had put an eye on the long white beaches. Rice cultivation was to replace the peculiar amphibious landscape. Thinking this through and taking the perspective of flamingos and waders and seabirds, Luc Hoffmann and his like concluded that it was about to launch a campaign and a political strategy in favor of waterlogged, humid and wet spaces. Migratory patterns of waterfalls served to define the MAR project and its map. And these migratory patterns connected regions and people within Europe and beyond. This project, however, was not about single species, it was about habitat. It was about Europe, and overall it was about empathy with those depending on waterlogged spheres. Modesty was no answer to the large-scale reclamation schemes. By actively applying the term wetland, a term hitherto not commonly used, the protagonists embraced almost any type of landscape characterized by water. Any pond, any wet meadow and estuary would now turn into a potential member, so to say, of the wetland community. Besides, the initiative started to list all valuable sites, the future inventory of internationally important wetlands all over Europe. The wetland people knew that they were up against vested interests. One of its protagonists, Christian Jean, identified an atavistic hostility of people towards swamps. He talked of, I quote him, inherited mental prejudice ingrained over thousands of years. This hostility constituted a severe handicap to Project MAR. He was right in that wetlands were still seen as hindrances, as obstructive landscapes, as places of disease, places that refrain from being exploited, spheres of depression and melancholy. Useless landscapes and idle fellows could not be accepted in those days of technical and economic euphoria. To take on with the reclamation phalanx, activists had to reset the narrative. So, how could the atavistic hostility be overcome? The first thing the MAR people did was to publish a booklet. That was what conservationists usually do. But they did so for mass distribution and to promote public awareness of the value of wetlands. And they made sure that the right people would get it, agriculturalists, people involved in reclamation schemes. They used a term from the stock market and called it liquid asset. It had not only a singularly apt title, but it also had a surprising format. It was quite large, chosen, and I quote one of the activists, chosen as one unlikely to be overlooked in an administrator's filing tray. 14,000 English copies were distributed throughout northwestern Europe, and then the French edition was supplied to the Mediterranean and Francophone countries. The brochure emphasized the aesthetic, educational, economic and social values of wetlands, and it declared wetlands are never wastelands. It went on by converting the most common negative stereotypes about wetlands into a positive feature. Wetlands were disease-ridden regions? No. They were essential for recreation and providing outdoor activities. Wetlands were areas of ignorance? No, no, no. They were spaces for education and applied science. Wetlands were monotonous and dull? No, they were steaming with life and diversity. Wetlands were areas of danger and environmental risk? No, they provided buffer zones, minimized the risk of flooding and erosion. It was the draining that destroyed the function of wetlands. Absorbing water, embankments caused flooding further downstream. So activists reversed not only the mental but the visual stereotypes. The giant plow, here he is, a decisive tool in reclamation programs, hitherto a motive signaling progress, turned into a tyrant's apparatus. Drained landscapes, hitherto symbols of rich and fertile territory, were contrasted by a bird's eye view of a free-running estuary, resembling a gigantic brain or an organic piece of art. It challenged the general interpretation of grazing cattle as icons of prosperity, or as the authors of the booklet put it, cattle are not the only measure of fertility. Biologically, a salt marsh is more productive than reclaimed land. So you could clearly see how ecologists wanted to have a say in judging the value of nature. And it posed a question of the emotional value of wetlands and its flora and fauna, and this quotation goes especially out to Tony Weiss. Do we really want to live alone on this earth, in a vegetable garden with only our cows and hens for company? There was a secret life in these wetlands worthy of being considered in a political discourse and spatial planning. Appreciating wetlands did not necessarily mean to lock swamps and ponds away and turn them into no-go areas of conservation. It was rather a plea for a more collaborative way to live with and alongside wetlands. It promoted human-made wetlands like salines, artificial lakes, and gravel pits. Wetlands could be used and worked with, but in a wise way. There were other creatures out there, however, who deserved peace in their own right. So this booklet is just one of the many pieces in a greater picture in the process of changing the image and imagination or in changing the perception of wetlands in the 1960s. I took a look at coffee table books and children's books, and it's really easy to get hold of them as they had a high number of copies and saw a wide distribution, and you don't find them so much in scientific libraries, but rather in with AB books or these giveaway boxes that we find all over the place in the digital age. So they provide telling examples and of the ways the notion of wetlands was changing fundamentally on a broader scale. Wetlands had not been among the most prominent motifs in modern landscape photography, as they are hard to catch up. They tend to lack vertical lines, they lack panoramatic features, they lack background. When European artists pictured bogs and fens, they were mostly characterized by work, by struggle, by hardship, and melancholy. In the late 1950s and 1960s, the visual storylines started to change, though. The young generation of wetland photographers offered a new plot. They presented wetlands rather as empires of diversity or as jungles of the neighborhood. The wetland photographers wanted to get deeper into the hidden world of the amphibians and secretive corncrakes and their like. They put on chest waders, waited and hid for hours and hours, and pretended to be part of the human world. The Camargue turned into a training ground for wetland photographers. Wildlife photography had always been a crucial device for informing a broader audience about the uniqueness of wilderness and fragile landscapes. In a way, the wetland movement featured embedded photojournalism. The WWF soon supported publications like this sticker book called Foray into European Swamps, authored by the Swiss photographer Hans Dolzenbach, who would soon become one of the most acclaimed wildlife photographers. He portrayed wetland creatures that suffered from a bad reputation like insects and toads and owls and snakes and newts. And he presented them in a way that made them look like stars of the wetland. Another children's book translated from Italian into German starred creepy animals like the leech. The books traveled. Wetland books from Czechoslovakia, for instance, were translated into German and showed not only the birds, but the birders. Not molesting a bird, but ringing it. Such prestigious coffee table books proved to be quite an influential instrument for getting the conservationist message across and for generating public interest. So the photographers acted as a kind of visual diplomats. There was a limit to experiencing and watching all the creatures and features hiding away in the reed belts and potholes, and the wetland paparazzi were the ones to supply the images of the beauty that the wetland activists wanted to conserve to the public. So before I come to an end, I would like to return to the bunch of flamingo admirers I mentioned in the beginning and the curious European moment in wetland protection. Among these admirers at Tour du Valais, there was Miss Vaughan Thomas. I'm afraid I couldn't get hold of a picture of her, so imagine a young lady, a delegate from the Council of Europe. The first European intergovernmental organization founded in 1949, not to be confused with the EU, including members like Switzerland and Turkey. Its aim was, and still is, to achieve, I quote, a greater unity between its members for the purpose of safeguarding and realizing the ideals and principles which are their common heritage. These ideas and principles, so the Council had just concluded at the beginning of the 1960s, embraced the will to protect the common European natural heritage. The loss of wetlands turned into a European experience. That is why Ms. Vaughan Thomas had traveled down to the Camargue to learn about Project Mar. Shortly afterwards, the Council launched an award labeling outstanding landscapes of European importance, and the first area endowed with the label was the Camargue. And soon after, it went to embark along the Belgian-German border, the Hohe Fen. So, here we find manifestations of European identity in the making. Wetlands turned into a symbol of the European common. After all, modern swamps were no longer wastelands. They turned into wetlands of transnational meaning, but also with the help of changing visual storylines. And so if you don't have any plans for the weekend, take off your shoes and visit a wetland like the Murnauer Moos. It's not that far away. They are areas and sites of European and environmental memory. Thanks a lot.